Chapter 27 of the Joss Reversion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zaanta. The Joss, a Reversion by Richard Marsh. Chapter 27. The Offerings of the Faithful. No notice was taken of Luke's inquiry. Instead, the whole place was filled all at once with a variety of discordant sounds. They seemed to proceed from the monsters which were ranged about the central figure. At the same time their arms began to move, their heads to waggle, their mouths to open and shut, their eyes to roll. Possibly, to the untaught savage, such an exhibition might have appeared impressive. It reminded me too much of the penny-in-the-slot figures whose limbs are set in motion by the insertion of a coin. The slight awe which I had felt for the figures vanished for good and all. "That's enough of it," I observed. "I like them better when they're still. Would whoever's pulling the strings mind taking a rest?" I had a sort of a kind of an idea that by someone or other my remark was not relished so much as it deserved. A suspicion that in some quarter there was a feeling of resentment that what had been intended to confound me should have ended in a fizzle. The noises stopped. The figures ceased to move. It was as if the coin in the slot had given us our pennyworth. Instead, something which, from my point of view, was very much more objectionable began to happen. From the immediate neighbourhood of the figure on the throne, snakes' heads began to peep. There was no mistake that they were all alive-o. The evil-looking brutes began to slither over the sides. I never could abide snakes, either in a figurative or a literal sense. The mere sight of one puts my dander up. Whipping a couple of revolvers out of my coat pockets, I headed the muzzles straight for them. Someone had better call those pretty darlings off before I shoot the eyes clean out of their heads. To my surprise, the warning was immediately answered.
"You'd better not shoot at them, my lad, or you'll be sorry."
The words came from the creature on the throne. "So you are alive, are you? You'd better call them off, or I'll shoot first and be sorry after."
"They're not touching you, you fool."
"No, and I'm not going to wait until they are." The things were coming unpleasantly close, their approach setting every nerve in my body on edge. In another second or two I would have fired. Luke caught me by the arm. "Gently, Captain, gently. The snakes won't hurt you. Our friend won't let them. It's only his way. Captain, let me introduce you to my old friend, Mr. Benjamin Batters. My friend and me haven't seen each other for years. Have we, Ben?"
"Can't say I ever wanted to see you."
Just so, just so. Still, friends do meet again. Ben, this is Captain Lander."
"He doesn't seem to know his proper place."
"When I glance in your direction, Mr. Batters, I'm inclined to make the same remark of you."
"Damn the man."
The creature proved himself to be very much alive by seizing one of the serpents in his huge hands and whirling it above his head as if it had been a club. Luke played the part of peacemaker. "Now, gentlemen. Come, Ben, no offence was meant, I'm sure. Tell the captain what you want. He's in rather a hurry, Captain Lander is."
"Then let him go to the devil and take his hurry with him."
"By all means. I wish you good evening, Mr. Batters." I swung round on my heels. The creature screamed after me.
"Stop, you fool, stop! I'm the Joss, the great Joss, the greatest god this country's ever known. In my presence all men fall upon their knees and worship me."
"Let 'em. Tastes differ. I like my gods to be built on other lines." I expected to be attacked by a shower of execration, but the creature changed his mood.
"And I'm sick of being a god. Sick of it. Dead sick. Curse your Josses is what I say. Damn 'em."
There followed a flood of adjectives.
"I want to get out of the place, to turn my back upon the whole infernal land, to never set eyes on it again. I'm an Englishman, that's what I am, an Englishman, British born and British bred. I want to get back to my native land. Captain Lander, or whatever your cursed name is, will you take me back to England?"
"When?"
"Now, at once, tonight."
"I do not carry passengers. I doubt if I have proper accommodation. What will you give me for taking you?"
"I'll show you what I'll give you."
The creature scrambled off his throne by means of his arms and hands, like some huge baboon. As I had suspected, he appeared to have no legs. Reaching the ground, he moved at what, under the circumstances, was an extraordinary pace. Wheels had been attached to the stumps of his legs. Using his hands as a monkey does its forearms, he advanced upon these wheels as if they had been casters. As we followed him, Luke whispered in my ear.
"You mustn't mind what he says. He's a bit off his chump, poor chap."
From what I can see, there seems to be a bit off him elsewhere besides the chump.
"Oh, he's lived a queer life. Been cut to pieces, stewed in oil, and I don't know what. He's a tough 'un. It's a miracle he's alive. I thought he was dead years ago. When I first knew him he was a finer man than me."
Mr. Batters had brought us to an apartment which seemed to be used as a repository for the treasures of the temple. The room was not a large one, but it was as full as it could hold. Curios were on every hand. Trading in Eastern seas, I had seen something of things of the kind. I knew that those I saw there had value. There were images, ornaments, vessels of all sorts and shapes and sizes, apparently of solid gold. He lifted the lid of a lacquered case.
"You see that? That's dust, gold dust. There are more than 20 cases full of it, worth at least £1,000 apiece. You see those?"
He was holding up another box for my inspection.
"Those are diamonds, rubies, pearls, sapphires, opals and turquoises."
"Real?"
"Real!"
he screamed.
"They're priceless, unique. They're offerings which the faithful have made to me, the great Joss. They come from men and women who are the greatest and the richest in the land. Do you think they would dare to offer me imitations? If they were guilty of such sacrilege, I would destroy them root and branch. And they know it."
The creature snarled like some great cat.
"Ha! I know something of stones, and I tell you you won't find finer gems in any jeweller's shop in London, nor any as fine."
He waved his arms.
"You won't match the things you see here in all Europe. Not in kings' palaces, nor in national museums. I know, and I tell you. If all the things you see in this place were put up in a London auction room for sale to-morrow, they'd fetch more than £1,000,000 down on the nail. I swear they would. If you'll take me with you to England to-night, me and my daughter here, this is my daughter, Susan. She's her father's only child."
The irony of it. My stars. A shudder went all over me as I thought of her being connected by ties of blood with such an object.
"If you'll give the pair of us ship room and all these things, they're all my property, every pin's worth, all offerings to the great Joss. You and your crew shall have half of everything you see. That shall be in payment of our passage."
Half! My mouth watered. His appraisement of the value of the things I saw about me went to all intents and purposes unheeded. Divide his figures by 20. Say their worth was £50,000. Half of that, even after I and Luke and Rudd and the rest of them had had their pickings, and out of a venture of this sort pickings there would have to be, the remnant would still leave a handsome profit for the owners. I knew the kind of men with whom I had to deal. Only give them a sufficient profit, I need not fear of being placed in their black books. However it might have come. And then there was half that collection of gems. I would have that too. And half the gold dust. Ye whales and little fishes, this might yet turn out the most profitable voyage I'd ever made. Yet I easily perceived that there might be breakers ahead. "You say that all these things are yours?"
"Every one. Every speck of gold dust. All. All. I am the only great Joss. They have been given to me."
"Then, in that case, there will be no difficulty in removing them." The response came brusquely enough, and to the point.
"That's where you're a fool. Do you suppose I'd share the plunder if there weren't? If it was known that I was going to make myself scarce, let alone hooking off with this lot of goods, there'd be hell to pay. I haven't stayed here all this time because I wanted. I had to. They made of me the thing you see, cut me to pieces, boiled, burned, and baked me, skinned me alive. Then they dipped me in a paint-pot and made of me a god. The next thing they'll make of me'll be a corpse. I can't stand being pulled about with red-hot pincers like I used to. There's 100 adjectived priests about this adjectived show. They all want to have a finger in my pie. When I had a word with Luke here, and arranged with him to have a word with you, I sent the whole damned pack off, miracle working, at a place 6 miles away from here. We'll have to be cleared off before they're back, or they'll be fighting. They can fight. And the man who falls into their hands alive, before they've done with him, will curse his mother for ever having borne him."
"How do you propose to go? Walk?"
"Walk!
He laughed, a laugh which wasn't nice to hear.
I haven't walked for 20 years, since they burned my legs off so that I shouldn't. When the great Joss goes abroad, he travels in his palanquin, there it is, and as he passes the people throw themselves onto the ground and hide their faces in the dust, lest, at the sight of his godlike form, they should fall dead. You'll have to fetch your chaps, and be quick about it. They'll have to carry me, and I'll stuff the palanquin as full as it will hold with the things which are best worth taking. I know 'em."
I reflected for a moment, then turned to Luke. "Do you think you can find your way to Rudd?" The girl interposed.
"Let me go. I shall be surer and quicker."
"You can't go alone. They won't take their orders from you." An idea occurred to me. "I'll come with you, and we'll take as many things with us as we can carry. Luke, you stay behind and help Mr. Batters put the things together in convenient parcels. I doubt if there'll be enough of us to take everything. Pick out the best. As time's precious, what we can't take we shall have to leave behind." I crammed my pockets with the smaller odds and ends, none the less valuable, perhaps, because they were small. I packed a lot of other things into a sort of sheet which I slung over my shoulder. The girl stowed as much as she could carry into the skirt of her queer-fashioned gown. She held it up as children do their pinafores. Out we went into the night. As we hurried along my breath came faster even than the pace warranted, at the thought of being alone in the darkness with her. We went some way before a word was spoken. Then I asked a question. "Do you want to go to England?"
"Want? Ah."
She gave a sigh, as of longing.
"I have wanted ever since I was born."
"Then you shall go, whoever has to stay behind."
"Stay behind? How do you mean?"
She seemed to read in my words a hidden significance.
"My father must go. If he stays, I stay also."
"Is he really your father?"
"Of course he is my father. My mother was one of the women of the country. They burned her when I was born."
"Burned her?"
"As a thank offering for having borne unto the great Joss a child."
She spoke in the most matter-of-fact tone. I wondered what sort of place this was I had got into, whether the people hereabouts were men or demons. She went on quietly.
"My father is the great Joss. It was a great thing to the people that a woman should have borne him a child."
A child who was a goddess. I was ashamed of myself directly the words were uttered. It seemed to be taking an unfair advantage to say things to her like that. But she didn't seem to mind.
"A goddess? That is what men worship."
"Just so. That is what men worship." She laughed to herself softly, so that only I, who was close at her side, could hear. There was that in the sound which set my blood on fire.
"If I am a goddess, whom you worship, then you must be a god, and I must worship you. Shall it be?"
I did not answer. Whether she was playing with me I could not tell. I knew all the while that it was just as likely. But there was something in the question, and in the way in which she asked it, which put all my senses in confusion. It was a wonder I didn't come a dozen times to the ground. My wits were wandering. We exchanged not another syllable. I had lost my tongue. As we neared Rudd he challenged us. "Who comes there?" "It's all right, Rudd. It's I." He was plainly surprised at the sight of my companion, but, being a discreet soul, asked no questions. Perhaps he had already concluded, being quite capable of drawing deductions on his own account, that queer things were in the air. "Stay where you are. I shall be back in a minute, and shall want you. I'm going to fetch the men out of the boat. There's a job of work on hand." We ran down the slope, found the boat where I had left it, deposited in it the things which we had brought away with us, no one offering a comment. As I unloaded I gave hurried instructions. In certainly not much more than the minute of which I had spoken to Rudd we were starting back to him. 1 man we left in the boat. 5 we took with us. Of their quality in a scrimmage I knew nothing, but, As I had suspected, each had brought with him something with which to make his mark in case of ructions. If one might judge from their demeanour, the suggestion that there might be friction ahead seemed to give them satisfaction rather than otherwise. Especially when I added a hint that there was plunder to be got by those who cared to get it. They put no inconvenient inquiries. Whose property it might chance to be was their captain's affair, not theirs. For once, in a way, they recognized the force of the fact that it was theirs only to obey. All they wanted was a share of the spoil. End of chapter 27. Recording by Zaanta. Chapter 28 of the Joss, a Reversion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zaanta. The Joss, a Reversion, by Richard Marsh. Chapter 28. The Joss Reverts. We passed through the forest in single file, the girl first, I next, the men hard upon each other's heels. We found Luke apparently alone. I thought that the Joss had returned for some purpose to the temple. "What's he gone for?" I asked. Luke made a movement with his forefinger, suggesting caution. He spoke in a hoarse whisper.
"He's not gone. He's there. In the palanquin."
His voice sank lower.
"I rather fancy that he don't want to be looked at more than he can help. Poor chap. He feels that, to look at, he ain't the man as once he was."
Luke grinned. Sympathy did not go very deep with him. The palanquin was drawn out upon the floor. The girl stooped over it.
"Father!"
A voice proceeded from within, a surly voice.
"I'm here, all right. Don't let's have any nonsense. Tell 'em to be careful how they carry me. I don't want to be jolted to bits by a lot of awkward fools. They're to hurry for all that. Those devils may be back at any minute. We've arranged the things as best we can. Luke will tell them what's to be taken first."
Luke volunteered to be one of the palanquin bearers, suggesting that Isaac Rudd should be the other. Isaac glanced doubtfully towards me. "It's all right, Mr. Rudd. There's a friend of mine in there, an invalid, who is not able to walk very well over uneven ground. If you will assist Mr. Luke, I'll be obliged. You'll find that you'll be able to carry him very easily between you." Isaac expressed his willingness to lend a hand, though I could see that he still had his doubts as to what was in the palanquin. To be frank, I was doubtful too. I wondered what it contained besides Benjamin Batters. Luke and his friend, considering the short time they had had at their disposal, had put the goods into convenient form for transit. Some had been packed in wooden cases, some in bundles, some in sacks. Each man took as much as he could carry, inquiring of himself, I make no doubt, what it was that he was bearing. I took my share. The girl took hers. Luke and Rudd shouldered the palanquin, the second in front, the first behind, Luke taking up his position in the rear, so that he might the more easily, if necessary, hold communication with its occupant. The procession started. The girl was its guide, now in advance, now at the palanquin side holding converse with her father. I gathered from what I heard that he was not in the sweetest temper. Luke and Rudd were not practised bearers. The way was difficult, the light trying. Now and then one or the other would stumble. The palanquin was jolted. From its interior issued a curse which, if not loud, was deep and strong. We reached the open on the crest of the slope without interruption. I was beginning to conclude that, consciously or unconsciously, Batters had exaggerated the danger which would attend his attempt at flight. We had borne him away, if not in triumph, at least with impunity, looted the temple of its best belongings. No one had endeavoured to say us nay. It might be almost worth our while to return for what we had left behind. Actual peril there appeared to be none. No one seemed cognizant of what was going on, or seemed to care. If the temple itself had been portable, we might have carried it away entire. The result apparently would have been the same. Thinking such thoughts, I watched Luke and Rudd go swinging down the slope in the moonlight. I almost suspected them of intentional awkwardness. They treated that palanquin to such a continuous shaking. Its occupant must have been gripping the sides with his huge hands, or surely he would have been dislodged and shot onto the ground. With a stream of adjectives he enlivened the proceedings. Small blame to him, said I to myself. If jolting's good for the liver, as I've heard, he'll have had a good dose of the medicine before he's through. If swearing'll make it easier, for the Lord's sake let him swear. And he swore. And right in the middle of about as full-flavoured a string of observations as I have ever heard, there arose a wild cry from the forest behind us. In a second the Joss's head appeared between the curtains.
Quick, quick! It's the devils! The devils!
It needed no urging from me, or from him either, to induce everyone concerned to quicken his pace. On a sudden the forest, where, a moment back, had reigned the silence of the grave, was now alive with shouts and noises. People were shrieking. What sounded like drums were being banged. Guns were being fired. The great Joss's absence was discovered. Possibly the absence of a good deal of valuable property had been discovered too. The alarm was being given. The priests, those pious souls who had burned the girl's mother alive as a reward for having borne the great Joss a child, were warning the country far and wide of what had happened. In a few minutes the whole countryside would be upon us. I don't fancy the fighting instinct was very hot in any of us just then. There was something ominous about that din. We were few. The proceedings on which we were engaged might appear odd regarded from a certain point of view. Fortunately we were near the boat. As luck would have it, when he was within a dozen paces of the water's edge, Luke, tripping over a bush or something, dropped onto his knee. The palanquin, torn from Isaac's shoulders, descended to the ground with a crash. What were Mr. Batter's feelings I am unable to say. I expected to see him shot through the roof, like a jack-in-the-box. But he wasn't. So far as I could tell in the haste and confusion, he was silent, which was ominous. The girl sank down beside the fallen palanquin with the evident intention of offering words of comfort to her revered, though maltreated, parent. Before she had a chance of saying a word, Luke had righted himself. Rudd had regained possession of the end which he had lost. Mr. Batters inside might be dead. That was a matter of comparative indifference. No inquiries were made. Somehow the palanquin was being borne towards the boat. Of exactly what took place during the next few minutes I have only vague impressions. I know that the palanquin was got into the boat somehow, with the great Joss, or what was left of him, still inside. The men, disposing of their burdens anywhere or anyhow, began to get out their oars. I dropped my loot somewhere aft. The boat was got afloat. The girl, who had all at once got as frightened of the sea as a 2-year-old child, I lifted in my arms, carried through 3 feet of water, and put aboard. I followed. A wild-looking figure came tearing after us down the slope. There were others, but he was in front, and I noticed him particularly. He was a tall, thin old party, dressed in yellow, with a bald head, and a face that looked like a corpse's in the moonlight. It was yellow, like his dress. As wicked a physiognomy as ever I set eyes upon. He was in a towering rage. When he got down to the shore we were in deep water, perhaps 20 yards away. He seemed so anxious to get at us I expected to see him start swimming after us. Not a bit of it. I rather imagine that the people just thereabouts were not fond of water in any form. He refused to allow the sea to damp so much as the tips of his toes. He screamed at us instead, to my surprise, in English. Not bad English either.
The Joss! The great Joss! Give us back our Joss!
Wouldn't you like it? I returned. I wasn't over-civil, not liking his looks. I wondered if he had had a hand in burning the girl's mother. He looked that sort of man. He raised his hands above his head and cursed us. He looked a quaint figure, standing there in the moon's white rays. And ugly, too. Dangerous if he had a chance. His voice was not a loud one, but he had a trick of getting it to travel.
You dog! You thief! You accursed! You have stolen from us the great Joss. But do not think that you can keep him. Wherever you may take him, though it be across the black water, to the land beyond the sun, we will follow. He shall be ours again. As for you, the flesh shall fall from off you, the foul waters shall rot your bones. You shall stink, mocker of the gods.
There was a good deal more of it. He continued his observations till we were out of hearing, repeating that he would follow us pretty well everywhere before he would allow that great Joss to be a bad debt. Though he was a barbarian and loose in his geography, it struck me that he meant what he said. If he could have laid his hands on me, and have had me in a position where I couldn't have laid mine on him, I should have had a nice little experience before he'd done. That was the kind of mood he was in. Long before he had said all that he had to say he was joined by quite a crowd. When he had about cursed himself out he started on a funny little entertainment of another kind. He made a fire close down by the sea. His friends formed about it in a circle. He stood in the centre. As the flames rose and fell he dropped things on them. Stuff which smoked and burned in different colours. The sort of rubbish which boys in England buy in ha'porths and penn'orths and make themselves a nuisance with. Possibly out there it costs more, so is thought a lot of. As he put his rubbish on his fire his friends moved round first one way and then the other, behaving themselves generally like fantastic idiots. And he threw himself into attitudes which would have been a photographer's joy. I had an impression that he was calling down the wrath of the gods upon our heads, and doing it in style. Our return to the ship created a good deal of excitement. One might lay long odds that every man on board had been watching, for all that he was worth, whatever there was to watch, without being able to make head or tail of what he had seen. So that our arrival just gave the final touch to the general curiosity. The things, whose departure those gentlemen on shore were weeping for, were got on board. The great Joss wanted to be hoisted up in his palanquin. When I pointed out that there were obstacles in the way, he came out of it with a rush and shinned up the ship's side like a monkey. His appearance on deck made things lively. The men took him for the devil, and shrank from him as such. Not wanting any more fuss than might be helped, I led the way down the companion as fast as I could. He came after me. Goodness alone knows how. It seemed to me he was as handy on no legs as some people upon two. His daughter followed. I had been turning matters over in my mind coming along. There had never been such a thing as a passenger known on the Flying Scud. At that moment there was a vacant two-berth cabin suited to people who might not be over and above particular. The great Joss and his friend Luke should have it. The great Joss's daughter should have Luke's quarters. When Luke appeared he professed himself agreeable. Indeed, too agreeable. There was an eagerness about the way in which he snatched at my suggestion which made me thoughtful even in that first moment. It was against nature that a man should be half beside himself with delight at the prospect of being berthed with such a monster. As I eyed Luke, noting the satisfaction which he was unable to conceal, I wondered what was at the back of it. However, so things were settled. Mr. Batters and the first mate were placed together. Miss Batters had the first mate's quarters. When I got on deck again, land was out of sight. I was disposed for solitude and a quiet think, but I wasn't to have them. I soon became conscious that Isaac Rudd was taking peeps at me. He kept coming up out of the engine-room, an oily rag in his hand, and a sort of air about him as if he wondered when I proposed to speak to him. At last I took the hint. "Well, Mr. Rudd, what is it?" He came up, wiping his paws with his oily rag. His manner was sententious. "I thought, sir, that you might have something which you wished to say to me." "About what?" "This little game." "What little game?" "The one we've just been playing. You see, we've all been taking a hand in it, and there's a kind of feeling aboard this ship that there might be something a little delicate about it, which might bring us into trouble before we're done. And no man likes to take a risk for nothing." "I see. That's it. You know me, and you know that I'm as good as my word. You may tell the men from me that if the venture is brought safely into port, and turns out what I expect, it will be £25 in the pockets of every man on board this ship, and 100 for each officer." "And what for the first engineer?" With that confounded oil rag of his he wiped his scrubby chin. "I'm thinking that, under the circumstances, I shouldn't like to guarantee that the engines'll last out for £100. They're just a lot of bits of iron tied together with scraps of string. To keep them going will mean sleepless nights." I laughed. "Ha! Are they so bad as that? I'm sorry to hear it, Mr. Rudd. Rudd, you're a blackguard. You want to rob your captain, and the owners." "Damn the owners." "That's against scripture. An owner's always blessed." "He'll never be upon the other side if he sends a ship to sea with such engines as we have." "They are a trial, aren't they, Rudd? There, that. So I think we may say that, under the circumstances, if the engines do last out, it will mean £500 in the pocket of the chief engineer. £500? I'm not denying it's an agreeable sum. I'd like to handle it. And it'll be no fault of mine if the machine blows up before it's just convenient. There's just one other question I'd like to put to you. Is it the devil that we've took aboard? It's not, but it's something that's seen the devil face to face and tasted of hell fire. Turning on my heel, I left Isaac to make of my words what he could. A variety of matters demanded my immediate consideration. I had pledged my word that every man on board that ship should, in case of a certain eventuality, receive a definite sum of money. The promise was perhaps a rash one, but there was reason behind it. It would have to be kept. Then there were the owners to be considered. And myself. Where were the funds to come from with which to do these things? What would they amount to, leaving fancy figures out? I should have to have a clear understanding with the great Joss. The sooner the better, while I still, as it were, had a pull on him. Isaac Rudd had lost no time. Neither would I. I went down the companion ladder to have that understanding. End of chapter 28. Recording by Zaanta. Chapter 29 of The Joss, a Reversion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zaanta. The Joss, a Reversion, by Richard Marsh. Chapter 29. The Father and His Child. The cabin door was fastened. I rapped. Luke inquired from within. "Who's there?" "I. Open the door." So far as I could judge, no attempt was made to do as I requested. There were whispers instead. The voices were audible, though the words were not. I rapped again. "Do you hear? Open this door." Luke replied. "Begging your pardon, Captain, but Mr. Batters isn't feeling very well. He hopes that you'll excuse him." A louder rapping. "Open this door." There were sounds which suggested that something was being done in a hurry. An exchange of what were apparently expostulatory murmurs. Then the great Joss spoke.
"This is my cabin, Captain Lander."
I cut him short. "Your cabin?" I brought my fist against the door with a bang. "If you don't open at once, I'll have the ship put about, take you back from where you came, and dump you on shore. I'm in command here, and all the cabins in this ship are mine. Now, which is it to be? Open or back?" Luke began to mutter excuses.
"If you'll just wait 5 minutes, Captain."
I felt convinced that they were doing something they didn't wish me to see, and which was highly desirable that I should see. I didn't wait for Luke to finish. I just planted my shoulder against the door and heaved. It leaped open. I had counted on the fastenings being rickety. There was Luke and the great Joss, with their hands full of papers and things which they had evidently just been attempting to conceal. The girl stood looking on. I took off my cap to her. "Miss Batters, I wish to speak to your father in private. Might I ask you to leave us?" She went without a word. I turned to Luke. "Mr. Luke, go up on deck and wait there till I come." There was an ugly look on his face.
"If you don't mind, Captain, I should just like—"
"Do as I tell you, sir, or you cease to be an officer on board this ship." He saw that I meant business, moved towards the door. "You needn't trouble to take those things with you."
"Put them down, you fool,"
growled Mr. Batters. Luke put them down and departed, not looking exactly pretty. When he had gone, pushing the door to, I stood with my back against it. The great Joss and I exchanged glances. He spoke first.
"You've a queer way of doing things."
"I have. Of which fact your presence here is an illustration."
"I have not shipped as one of your crew. I'm a passenger."
"At present. Whether you continue to be so depends on one or two things. One is that you behave. You come from a place where there are some queer customs."
"What do you mean by that?"
"What I say." He winced in a fashion I did not understand, causing me to surmise that the customs in question might be even queerer than I supposed. The first time, Mr. Batters, you show disrespect for any orders I may give, or wishes I may express, the ship goes round. You go back. I fancy your friends will be glad to receive you back among them." He glared at me with his one eye in a manner I did not altogether relish. There was an uncanniness about his looks, his ways, his every movement. As he confronted me, squatted on the floor, he was the most repulsive-looking object I had ever seen. It was hard to believe that such a creature could be human. And English! The sight of him filled me with a sense of nausea. I hastened to go on. "There is another point on which your continuance as a passenger depends. What do you propose to pay for your passage?"
"I've told you. Halves."
"That is too indefinite. I want something more definite. Moreover, it is the rule for passage money to be paid in advance."
"If you prefer that way of doing business, you shall have £100 apiece for us, and I'll give you the money now."
"Is that all? Then the ship goes round."
"You shall have more if you'll only wait."
"How long?"
"Till I've had time to look about me. You can't expect me to have everything cut and dried before I've been on board 10 minutes. You see these things?"
I did. They were everywhere. I wondered where Luke and he proposed to sleep.
"They're worth £1,000,000.
Nonsense.
"It's not nonsense, you fool."
The opprobrious epithet was seasoned with a profusion of adjectives. "Mr. Batters, that is not the way in which to address the commander of a ship. As I see that you and I are not likely to understand each other, I will give instructions to put the ship about at once, and take you back. It's plain I made a mistake in having anything to do with you." I made as if to go.
"Stop, you idiot."
"Mr. Batters, what did you observe?"
"I apologize. I apologize. What you say is right. I have been used to rummy ways. I can't slough 'em at sight. Even a snake takes time to change its skin. But when you talk about the value I set on the things I've got here being nonsense, it's you who are mistaken, not me. Look at that."
He held up a hideous-looking image. I took it from him, to find it heavier than I had expected.
"That's gold. Solid. Weighs every bit of 20 pounds. 16 ounces to the pound. It's got diamonds for eyes. 25 or 30 carats apiece. Pearls for teeth. And its forehead is studded with opals. The stones in the rings, bracelets and bangles are all real. I tell you what you're holding in your hands is not worth far short of £50,000.
"It may be so. I'm no judge of such things. But what proof have I of the correctness of your statements?"
"That's it. What proof have you? You've only my word. You may cut my heart out if I'm wrong. And what I say is this. When we get to London, we'll have them all sold, or else valued, whichever you please. You shall either have half the things, toss for first choice, then choose, turn and turn about, or half of whatever they fetch."
"You'll give me a written undertaking to that effect?"
"I will."
"And I can take an inventory of everything you have?"
"If you like."
"And remove them to my cabin for safer custody?"
"If you think that they will be safer there. You can stow 'em in the hold for all I mind. All I want is for them to be safe and have my fair half. Only I don't see what harm they'll do in here, except that you bursted off the lock, which is a thing as can be replaced. I'm not likely to leave the ship, and I'll watch it that they don't go without me."
There seemed reason in what he said. It sounded fair, above board enough. Though every pulse shrunk from his near neighbourhood, crying out that there was that about him which was good neither for man nor beast, I could not but admit to myself that this was so. I was still holding in my hand the obscene image which, according to him, was worth £50,000. I had been watching Mr. Batters. Glancing from him to it, I saw that, perched upon its head, was a little doll-like looking figure, as long perhaps as my middle finger. It was not there a second before. I wondered whence it came, how it retained its place. "What's this?" I asked.
"That?"
There was a curious something in Mr. Batters' tone which set my nerves all jangling.
"Where I've been, they call that the God of Fortune. It's my very own God. It watches over me. When you see it, I'm never far away."
I reached out my disengaged hand to take hold of it for examination, but I seemed to have grown dizzy all of a sudden, and clumsy. It must have been because I was clumsy that, instead of grasping it, I knocked it off its perch. It fell to the floor. I stooped to pick it up.
"I don't think you'll find it. I expect it's gone."
It did seem to have gone. Or perhaps my sudden dizziness prevented my seeing so small an object in the imperfect light. I certainly did feel strangely giddy. So overpowered was I by most unusual sensations that, yielding the £50,000 horror into Mr. Batter's outstretched hand, almost before I knew I found myself on the other side of the cabin door. I staggered up on deck. The night air did me good. I drew great breaths. The giddiness passed. I began to ask myself what could have caused it. Had Mr. Batters been practising a little hocus-pocus, playing up to the part of the great Joss? If I had been sure, I would have put the ship about right there and then. Back he should have gone, to play the part out to the end. Luke hailed me. "Begging pardon, captain, but may I go below? Mine's the next watch. I should like a wink of sleep." "You may. A word with you before you go. You got me into this business. I'm not sure I thank you. What do you know about this man Batters?" He looked up at the stars as if for an answer to my question. "Him and me was boys together." "And since?" "We've come across each other once or twice, but it's half a lifetime since we met." "You seem to have recognized each other pretty quickly when you did meet." "He knew me. I didn't know him. And never should have done. Never. I can't hardly believe now it's the Ben Batters I used to know. Only he's proved it." "How came he to be what he is?" "That's more than I can say. He hasn't told me no more than he's told you. He always was a hot 'un, Ben was. Bound to get into a mess before he'd done. Always a fightin'. But I never thought he'd have come to this. Fine figure of a man he used to be. They must have took the skin right off him. Used him something cruel." I shuddered at the thought. Better to have died a dozen deaths. "Do you think he's to be trusted?" "Well, as for trusting, that depends. Seems to me no one's to be trusted more than you can help." I felt, as he went, that he had summed up his own philosophy. He trusted no one. It was the part of wisdom for no one to trust him. I wished that, in my haste, I had not berthed the two together. The first excuse which offered, Luke should be shifted. I did not like the notion of such a pair hobnobbing. The stake was too big. Someone touched me on the arm. It was the girl. "Miss Batters, you ought to be in your berth. It's late." Her answer surprised me.
"I'm afraid."
She stood so close that I could hear a little fluttering noise in her throat, as if she found it hard to breathe. I wondered if she was affected by the motion. She did not look as if she were. She was straight as a dart. And beautiful. "Afraid? Of what?"
"Of the water. There is trouble on the sea. Evil spirits live on it."
"You needn't be afraid of evil spirits while you're with me. Who's put such notions into your head? English girls aren't afraid of the sea. And you are English."
"Is it alive?"
"Is what alive?"
"The ship."
"The ship?"
"What makes it go? It rushes through the water. It trembles. I feel it trembling beneath my feet. It makes a noise."
"Those are the engines."
"The engines? Are they alive?"
"Alive? Yes. While Mr. Rudd and his friends keep feeding them, they're alive. Come and have a look at them."
"No, I dare not. I'm afraid."
"There's nothing to be afraid of. This is a steamer. The engines drive it along. Don't you know what a steamer is? Haven't you ever heard of one?" She shook her head. I didn't know what to make of her. Her ignorance was something beyond my experience. Presently she was off on a fresh track.
"Is England far?"
"Pretty well. If we've luck we shall get there in about a month."
"A month? 4 weeks?"
I nodded.
"I cannot live 4 weeks upon the sea."
She gave what seemed to me to be a gasp of horror. "Oh, yes, you can. You'll get to love it before you've done."
"Love it? Love the sea? No one ever loves the sea."
"Don't they? That's where you're wrong. I do, for one."
My lord!
All in a second down she flopped upon the deck. I was never so flummoxed in my life. I couldn't think what was wrong. " Miss Batters, what is wrong?" She turned her lovely face up to me, still on her knees.
" Are you the Lord of the Sea?"
"The Lord of the Sea! For goodness sake get up. The watch will think you're mad, or that I'm threatening to murder you." I had to lift her before she'd move. Then she seemed reluctant to stand upright in my august presence. I tried my best to disabuse her mind of some of her wild notions. "I'm a plain sailor man, I am. I've sailed the sea, boy and man. The best part of my life, east and west, north and south. And though I don't mind owning I like a spell of dry land for a change, it would be strange if I hadn't grown to love it. I'm ready to grumble at it with any man. I'm no more lord of the sea than you are. I'm just captain of this ship. That's all."
"You are the captain of this ship?"
"That's it, Miss Batters."
"Why do you call me that?"
"Call you what?"
"Miss Batters. I am not Miss Batters. I am Susan."
I had been looking away. When she said that I looked at her. I wished I hadn't. There was something on her face, in her eyes, which set me all of a flutter. Something had come to me since I had entered those waters. I didn't used to be easily upset. I couldn't make it out at all. I couldn't meet her glance, but looked down, smoothing the deck with the toe of my shoe, not recognizing the sound of my own voice when I heard it. I don't know that I quite care for the name of Susan. I think I prefer Susie.
"Susie? What's that?"
"That? That's the name your friends will call you."
"My friends?"
She gave another little gasp.
"Susie?"
To hear her say it.
"But I have no friends."
"You will have. Heaps."
"But I have none now. Not one."
"Well," I cleared my throat. I had never been so stuck for a word before. Could have kicked myself for being such a fool. She took my clownishness as implying a reproach. I could tell it from her tone.
"No, I have no friend. Not one."
I made another effort. I wasn't lacking as a rule. I couldn't understand what ailed me then. "Well, it's early days for me to speak of friendship, since I've only known you for an hour or two, but if I might make so bold, Miss Batters—"
"Miss Batters!"
She stamped her foot, her little bare foot.
"I am not Miss Batters. I am Susie."
Her tone had changed with a vengeance. Her manner too. She was every inch a queen. A few feet more.
"Can I not be Susie to you?"
I turned away. I only wanted to get hold of myself. She put my head in such a whirl. But before I had a chance of finding out whereabouts I was, her voice rang out like a boatswain's whistle.
"I hate sailor men."
I turned again to stare.
"And I hate the sea."
Before I could slip a word in edgeways she had swung herself around and vanished down the companion ladder. I took off my cap to wipe my forehead. Though the night was cool, my brow was damp with sweat. This is going to be a lively voyage, on my word. I had never said a truer thing since the day that I was born. End of chapter 29. Recording by Zaanta. Chapter 30 of the Joss, a Reversion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zaanta. The Joss, a Reversion by Richard Marsh. Chapter 30. The morning's news. It was a lively voyage. Oh yes, for those who like that kind of liveliness. Everything went wrong, just in the old sweet way. Rudd had to sleep with his engines. As sure as he turned his back on them for 5 consecutive minutes, something happened. I began to wonder if we shouldn't have got on faster if we had had sweeps aboard. You don't often see hands starting to row a steamer along. But anything was better than standing still, or being blown back, which was worse. It was no use rigging a sail against the winds we had, or we might have tried that. But the wind was against us, like everything else. The weather seemed to have cleared on purpose to give us a chance of getting the Great Joss aboard. It broke again directly afterwards. More than once, and more than twice, I wished it hadn't. Then perhaps we shouldn't have been favoured with the company of Mr. Batters. In shipping him we'd shipped a Tartar. I became inclined to the belief that we owed half of our bad luck to him. The crew was dead sure that at his door could be laid the lot of it. They swore he was the devil himself, or his brother. I wasn't sure they were far out. Either what he had gone through had affected his brain, or he was possessed by the spirit of mischief, or there was something uncanny about him. I never knew anything like the tricks he was up to. Weather had no effect on him. As for decent hours, he scorned them. It's my belief that what sleep he had was in the day. I know he was awake pretty well at night. Once I was dragged out of my berth in the middle of the night because he was frightening the watch out of their senses. When I got on deck I found a heavy sea. Everything sopping. The seas breaking over the scuppers. Pitch darkness. And Mr. Batters up in the tops. The crew were of opinion that he was holding communion with his friends in hell. I shouldn't have been surprised. He looked as if he was at something of the kind. How he kept his place was a wonder. Although he had no legs, he seemed to have a knack of gluing himself to whatever he pleased. Up there he had an illumination all on his own. It must have been visible for miles across the sea. He had smeared himself and everything about him with something shiny, phosphorus or something. He always was playing tricks with stuffs of the kind. It made him look as if he was covered with flames. He was waving his arms and going through an acrobatic performance. Snakes were twining themselves about the illuminated rigging. The old villain had smuggled a heap of them in his palanquin. He lived with them as if they were members of his family. They seemed to regard him as akin. Talk about snake charming. I believe that at a word from him they would have flown at anyone just as certainly as a dog would have done. No wonder the watch didn't altogether relish his proceedings. I sang out, "Come down out of that, Mr. Batters, before there's trouble." I did put a bullet into one of his precious snakes. It was this way. I had a revolver in my hand. The boat gave a lurch. The trigger must have caught my coat sleeve. It snapped. There was a flash. A report. One of his snakes straightened itself out against the blackness like a streaming ribbon. You could see it gleam for a moment. Then it vanished. I suppose it dropped into the sea. A good thing, too. The idea was that it had been hit by that unintentional shot. I can only say that if that was the case it was the victim of something very like a miracle. Old Batters understood what had happened long before I did. He came down that rigging like 10 mad monkeys. And he went for me like 20. If the watch hadn't been there he'd have sent me after that snake. It took the lot of us to get the best of him. If the men had had their way they'd have dropped him overboard. I wished I had let them before I finished. A more artful old dodger never breathed. I drew up the agreement of the spoils, but it was days before I could get him to set his hand to it. At first he pretended he couldn't write. As it happened, I had seen him write. It seemed to me he was always writing. When at last I had induced him to sign, in the presence of Luke, Rudd and Holly, he eluded me on the subject of the inventory. I could not get one. His stock of excuses was inexhaustible. And they were all so plausible. It is true that I made notes of a good many things without his knowledge, but a formal inventory I never had. As to my suggestion that at least the more valuable things should be removed to my cabin for safe custody, when I renewed it he expressed his willingness on conditions that he went with them and his snakes. I declined. On those terms I preferred that he should remain custodian. Then there was his intimacy with Luke. That continued, in spite of my attempts to stop it. Though they grew slacker when I began to suspect that after all Mr. Luke might not be on such good terms with his boyhood's friend as he perhaps desired. I got my first hint in this direction when, one afternoon, someone was heard bellowing in Mr. Batter's cabin like a bull. I made for it. I found Mr. Luke upon the floor, his friend upon his chest, his friend's hands about his throat. He was not bellowing just then. Mr. Batters had squeezed the grip right out of him. He was purple. In about another minute he would have known what death by strangulation meant. We got his dear friend off him. The dear friend said unkind things about Mr. Luke. By the time we had brought the first mate round he was about as limp a man as you might wish to see. He made one remark, which was unprintable. He turned round in his bunk, where we had laid him, and for all I know he went to sleep. Since, before that, I had taken care to see that he was berthed apart from Mr. Batters, there was nothing to disturb his slumber. After that I did not feel it necessary to keep quite so sharp an eye on the attentions which he paid our passenger. They did not seem to be so friendly as they had been before. As if I hadn't enough to plague me, there was the girl. When I begin to write of her my language becomes mixed, as were my feelings at the time. And there were moments when she got me into such a state that I didn't know if I was standing on my head or heels. She was her father's own child, though it seemed like sacrilege to connect the two. Insubordination wasn't in it along with her. She twisted me round her finger. Except when I stiffened my back and felt like stowing her in the long-boat and cutting it adrift with a bag of biscuit and a can of water. And then, 5 minutes afterwards, I'd feel like suicide for ever having thought of such a thing. She wore me to a shadow. The sea agreed with her far better than I had expected, or she either, especially considering the weather we had. She was all over the boat. All questions, like a child. There was nothing you could tell her enough about. It was extraordinary how the taste for imparting information grew on one. If you didn't explain everything that could be explained, and a good deal that couldn't, it wasn't for want of trying. She had got together a mixed-up lot of facts before she had been upon that vessel long. Because when you begin to look into things you find that there are a good many you think you know all about, till a sharp-witted young woman starts you on to telling her all you do know. Then, before you've time to wriggle, you are stuck. There are men who sooner than get that will say anything. It is bad enough to feel you are making a fool of yourself when the subject is why steamers don't sink when they're floating, or why engines shove them along, or that kind of thing. But when the question's what love is, and you feel but can't tell, it's worse.
Why do you say you love me?
I had mentioned to her casually that I did, being driven clean off my balance before I knew it, though I meant every word I had said, and about 200,000 more, in spite of my having had more trouble with her old villain of a father that very afternoon, and being full of hope that when it came to hanging him I should be there to see. Because I do.
But what is love?
Love? Why, love. It was evening. The wind had been falling away all day. Now it was dead calm, the first we had had since shipping Batters. We were something over 1,200 miles from Aden. There's the exact spot marked on my chart, but I should never forget it if it wasn't. That mark means adjectives. I had had it all out with Batters about our route. The short cut was what he wanted. It was what I wanted too, but what I did not want was to pay the canal dues. In fact, I couldn't. There was not enough money belonging to the ship on board. I hadn't told Batters as much as that, but I had made it clear to him that he would have to pay. So the arrangement stood that we were to come home by Suez, and he was to hand me over the coin to take us through. We should have to coal at Aden. How we had managed so far was beyond my understanding. Rudd was a marvel. He would make a skip of coal go as far as some men would a ton. Stores we had taken in here a little and there a little, living from hand to mouth, but we had bought no coal. I had said to Rudd, "Shall we run into Colombo and have some put into our bunkers there?" He pondered. It was his way to ponder. Then shook his head. "I'm thinking we'll last to Aden. I'm thinking it. And I don't seem to fancy a stop at Colombo with Mr. Batters aboard." I looked to see from his face if his words had any hidden meaning. There seemed to be something behind everything he said, till you grew tired of trying to find out what it was. He was always dropping hints, was Rudd. There appeared to be nothing unusual about his wooden-looking countenance, so I concluded to give his words their dictionary meaning. "If you think we can last to Aden, we will. It will save time, and coal's cheaper there." So it was settled. And now we were heading straight for Aden. The weather had cleared. I had told the girl I loved her. Every vein in my body was on fire because of it. Luke was on the bridge. I felt that in spite of the darkness, and it was pretty dark, as well I remember, his eye was on us as much as on the ship's course. We had been walking up and down for exercise. She was leaning over the taffrail, apparently preparing to enter on a kind of philosophical discussion about what love was.
Is it good to love?
"That depends." My tone was grim.
Do I love you?
"I should like to hear you say so."
I love you.
I thought that was what she said, but she was leaning so far over, seeming to be watching the smudge of soap-suds we were leaving behind us, that I couldn't quite catch her words, though I was all of a quiver too. What do you say?
I say I love you.
Susie, do you mean it?
I don't know. I don't know what love is. How should I? I'm only a savage. You said so the other day. I want telling things.
You don't want telling what love is?
Do you mean that you don't want to tell me? You never will tell me what I really want to know. I'll ask one of the men. I'll ask Luke. He tells me things.
Susie, Luke's too fond of interfering in matters which are no business of his. He'll get himself into trouble before he's done.
Why?
Don't you dare to ask Luke what love is.
Dare? I dare do anything. I'll go and ask him now.
She'd have been off if I hadn't caught her arm. Susie, don't. For my sake.
Then tell me. Tell me yourself.
Stamp went her foot. It was one of her favourite tricks. Directly she lost patience, down it went. I'll tell you if you'll give me time. I tried to find the words, but couldn't. I held out my arms instead. It's this.
What?
Don't you understand?
What am I to understand?
Don't you understand that I want you to be my wife?
Your wife? Your wife?
She spoke in a crescendo scale, as if I had insulted her.
You said you were my friend.
Don't you understand that I want to be something more than your friend?
You want to beat me, to use me like a dog, to have me burned.
Susie.
My father said in England there were no wives.
No wives in England? He was making fun of you.
He was not making fun of me. He has told me all my life. When I asked him why they burned my mother, he said because she was his wife. He is an Englishman. In England they have no wives.
I had a glimpse of the confusion which was in her mind, but at that moment I was incapable of straightening out the evil. Your father's was a peculiar case. There are wives in England.
Is that true?
She thrust her face close to mine. She was terrifically in earnest. It is perfectly true. They abound.
Then I will not go to England.
But, Susie, you've got hold of the wrong end of the stick. In England a wife's the man's superior.
It's a lie. See how you stammer? You cannot lie like my father, with an even tongue. A wife is her husband's slave. At his bidding she fetches, and she carries. He beats her as he beats his dog. When she grows old, he takes another, and she dies.
My dear Susie, I assure you that that description does not apply to England. There, unless she's a wife, a woman isn't happy.
Then in England women are more unhappy than in the country from which I come. I will not go there. I will not go to any place where there are wives.
She strode past me as I stared at her, thunderstruck. I continued thunderstruck when she had gone. She had a great deal to learn. That night I slept badly. In the morning I was roused by someone hammering at the door. "Who's there?"
"It's me, sir. Holly. The cutter's gone."
"What?"
"The cutter's gone, and the watch is hocussed."
I was standing at the door in my nightshirt. "What the devil do you mean? Where's Mr. Luke?"
"He had the morning watch. He's gone too. It's his chaps as is hocussed. Leastways, they're lying on the deck like logs. And Mr. Batters, he's gone. And his things. His cabin's stripped clean. And his daughter, she's gone."
Holly!
I was thrusting myself into a pair of trousers. All of a sudden the ship stopped dead, with an unpleasant shock. "What's that? She can't have struck." I rushed up. Rudd met me. "I have to report to you, sir, that the engine's ceased to work." "Very well. Patch it up and start it again as soon as you can. It's not the first time it's stopped."
"But I'm thinking it'll be the last. Someone's been playing tricks with the machine. I'm fearing it's Mr. Luke."
End of chapter 30. Recording by Zaanta. Chapter 31 of the Joss, a Reversion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zaanta. The Joss, a Reversion, by Richard Marsh. Chapter 31. The Termination of the Voyage of the Flying Scud. We had been completely done. So completely that it was some time before I was able to realize that I had been diddled quite to that extent. Not a detail had been overlooked. Mr. Batters and Mr. Luke had gone conscientiously to work. They had been thorough. They had left us the ship. That was about all. They would probably have taken that if they had had any use for it. It seemed they hadn't. If I could only have laid hands on that latest thing in freaks, there would have been one Joss less. I would willingly have made a Joss of Luke if I had only had a chance. To have boiled, burned, and skinned him would have been a pleasure. He should not only have been legless, he should have been armless too. As for that girl, who didn't want to go to a place where there were any wives, she should have become acquainted with a climate where there was something less agreeable. That was how I felt towards her at first, but after a while I came to the conclusion that she had been under the domination of her father, hadn't dared to call her soul her own. So anger turned to pity. I would just simply take her to a place where there were wives. I'd let her know what it felt like to be one. That would be punishment enough for her. As for Luke and Batters, what wouldn't I have given for a quiet half-hour with the pair, with boiling oil, branding irons, and everything just handy. Mr. Luke must have stowed pretty well all our eatable stores inside that cutter. As first mate, under peculiar circumstances, I had let him do, in some respects, a good deal as he pleased. He had had the run of the stores. He had not gone far from collaring the lot. It seemed that certain of the hands had noticed him fiddling a good deal with the cutter of late, especially when he had been in charge of either of the night watches. But, of course, they had said nothing to me till it was too late, which was a pity. Mr. Batters had taken with him all the treasures of the temple, those offerings of the faithful, half of which were to have been mine. No wonder he had not been of opinion that they would have been safer in my cabin. And he pledged his word that he would make it his especial business to see that not one of them left the ship until he did. That elegant monster which he valued at £50,000 had gone. Even the palanquin. Oh, it was pretty. Mr. Luke had made everything snug by generously treating the members of the morning watch to a little drink directly they came on duty. That drink was no doubt one of Mr. Batters' concoctions. They remembered no more so soon as they had swallowed it. So for 4 hours Mr. Luke had the deck to himself. No watch was kept. The wheel was lashed. The cutter was filled with the treasures of the temple, then lowered. Goodness and Mr. Luke alone know how. And it must be remembered that Mr. Batters was an ingenious man. It was reported from the engine room that the order was received to go slow. Probably while the Flying Scud went slow the cutter was cast loose, with Mr. Batters and the girl inside it. Shortly afterwards the order was changed to full steam ahead. The inference seems to be that immediately after giving that order the ingenious Mr. Luke went overboard to join the cutter. And the Flying Scud went full steam ahead, with no one on the lookout. Under the circumstances it was perhaps just as well that the engines did break down. It's an elegant story for the commander of a ship to have to write, especially one with a clean certificate and of sober habits. There we were, without engines, without coal, without stores, without enough cargo to act as ballast, about halfway between Aden and Colombo. We were a mad ship's company. For my own part I felt like cutting any man's throat, including my own. All that day we hung about, doing nothing, except cursing. Towards night, the engines proving hopeless, we rigged a sail. There was just about enough wind to laugh at us. So we let it laugh us along. There was no canal for us. The man who was to have paid our shot had gone, the shot with him. So we headed for the Cape. The long way round was the only way for us. Engineless, the prospect was inviting. There is no need to speak in detail of the remainder of that voyage, no need at all. In one sense it was over, quite. In another it was only just beginning. I won't say how long it took us to reach home, or what we suffered before we got there, and will only hint that by the time we sighted English waters I felt as if I was a twin brother of Methuselah's. We hadn't walked the entire distance, but we might almost just as well have done. It was evening when I landed. There was a mist in the river. A drizzling rain was falling. Appropriate weather with which to bid us welcome home. The lights of London gleamed dimly through the fog and wet. So soon as I had set foot on land, I saw, coming at me through the uncertain light, the individual who, as he stood with his friends upon that moonlit shore, had cursed us for bearing the great Joss to the ship across the motionless waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. Since that night we had ourselves anathematized someone else for serving us as we had served him. I had only seen him once, and then from some little distance in the moonshine, but there was no possibility of mistaken identity. This was the man. He was dressed in the same fantastic garb, and came at me like a ghost out of Shadowland. He took me by the shoulders, and he cried, as he had done upon that moon-kissed shore, "The great Joss! The great Joss! Give us back the great Joss!" Exactly what took place I cannot say. I was so taken aback by the unexpectedness of the encounter, having never dreamed that I should set eyes upon the man again, that for some moments sheer surprise robbed me of my faculties. Before I was myself again the man had gone. Others had thrust him from me. Although I rushed here and there among the people who stood about, I could not find him. He had vanished. I had swallowed a good many bitter pills since last I left that wharf. The bitterest was still to come. I had to pay my visit to the owners. On the night of my arrival it was too late to see them. The pleasure was postponed to the morning. It was a pleasure. I came out from their presence a disgraced man. Which was no more than I had expected, though it was no easier to bear on that account. The blame was wholly mine. So they would have it. For some of the language which they used to me I found it hard to keep my hands from off them. My tale of the great Joss, and of all that I had hoped to gain for them by that adventure, they received with something more than incredulity. If the thing had resulted as I had hoped, that they would have pocketed their share of the spoils, and betrayed no scruples, I knew them too well to doubt. But because, as I held, through no fault of mine, the affair had miscarried, there was no epithet too opprobrious for them to bestow on me. By their showing I had been guilty of all sorts of crimes of which I had never heard. I had betrayed their trust, smirched their good name, as if in the eyes of those who knew them it could be smirched, been guilty of piracy, acted like a common thief, offended against the law of nations, brought shame on England's mercantile marine. Oh, it was grand to hear them talking. They might have been saints from whose brows I had plucked the halos. They were good enough to explain that it was only because they disbelieved my entire story, and placed no credence in any part of it whatever, that they refrained from handing me over to the properly constituted authorities, to be by them passed on to the Chinese government, to be dealt with as my offences merited. They took me for a jay, and were so kind as to add that they looked upon the tale as a clumsy, dishonest, and disingenuous attempt to draw a red herring across their track — the phrase was theirs — and so prevented them from taking proper and adequate notice of the scandalous neglect of duty and of their interests of which, to my lasting shame, I had been guilty. It was a rare wigging that I had. And, to the best of their ability, they included in it everyone who had been with me on board the Flying Scud. There were 4 of us, at least, who swore that we'd be even for it with someone, somehow. Isaac Rudd, Sam Holly, his chum Bill Cox, and I. We were the 4. And all we had to go upon to help us towards getting even was a scrap of paper, half a sheet of common note. It was the only thing Mr. Batters had left behind him. I had found it in a corner of his cabin, crumpled up into a sort of ball, as though he had thrown it there and forgotten all about it. On it this was written: "To my niece, Miss Mary Blyth, care of Messrs. Martin and Branksome, Drapers, Shoreditch." We would look the lady up. Where the niece was, the uncle might not be far away. At least she might have some knowledge of his whereabouts. If she had, we would have it too, or know the reason why. I still had the written undertaking, which he had signed, by which he was to divide with me equally, as a consideration for services rendered, the treasures of the temple. I had handed this to the owners as proof of the truth of my statements. They had thrown it back to me with a sneer, and something worse than a sneer. That act amounted to a renunciation of all interest in any property which the document conveyed. Or so it seemed to me. Good. They might smart for their scepticism yet. Let us find the niece, then the uncle. If Miss Blyth could only give us a hint as to where he might be found, though it was on the other side of the world, we'd find him. He had valued his belongings at $1 million. We might be snatched out of the gutter yet. The search began badly. They knew nothing of a Miss Blyth at Messrs. Martin and Brankson's, or so I was informed by an official individual in the counting-house. That was a facer. It looked as if Mr. Batters, at his tricks again, had purposely placed in our way what seemed like a clue to his lair for the sake of having still another game with us. But a night or two afterwards I tackled a young fellow as he was coming out of the shop after closing hours, and put my question to him. He turned it over in his mind before he answered. "There's no Miss Blyth here now, but there was. I believe her name was Mary. I could soon find out. She's left some time. Directly after I came. I can't think where she went. I've heard the name, but I can't remember. I might inquire if you like, and let you know to-morrow night." I agreed. He did inquire. The next night he let me know. Miss Blyth had gone to a big shop which he named at Clapham. The next day, being engaged, I let Rudd go over to Clapham to see what he could do. He made a mess of things. The lady was pointed out to him by one of her fellow assistants. Before he could get within hail of her she slipped round a corner and was out of sight. Came across her again in a restaurant where she couldn't pay her bill. Paid it for her. Then, as he was about to follow her with a view of pursuing his inquiries, he saw, standing on the pavement in front of the place, the individual who had cursed us on that moonlit shore. The sight of him struck Rudd all of a heap. By the time he recovered his presence of mind, the lady had vanished, and the gentleman too. The juxtaposition of Miss Blyth and that cursing gentleman seemed to suggest that we were on the right track of the retiring Mr. Batters. What is more, that the scent was getting hot. The evening after I called at that Clapham establishment, just as the premises were being closed, and asked to see Miss Blyth. Some jackanapes informed me that the young woman had been dismissed that very day. He didn't know what her address was, but had heard that she had gone off with a party who called himself Frank Paine, and who said he was a lawyer. At that it was my turn to be struck all of a heap. A short time previously I had called upon Mr. Frank Paine, intending to ask his opinion as to the validity of the document which had Mr. Batters' name attached. But somehow the conversation got into other channels. I came away without it. Not by so much as a word had he hinted that he knew anything about Mr. Batters or his niece. As I walked along pondering these things, Rudd, at my side, suddenly exclaimed,
"Captain, there she is. That's Miss Blyth, the young lady for whom I paid the bill."
He was pointing towards two young women who were advancing in our direction on the opposite side of the road. Having got it clear to which of the pair he referred, I sailed across to meet them. She was Miss Blyth. She admitted as much. But that was all the satisfaction I received. She staggered me with the information that her uncle, Mr. Benjamin Batters, was dead. As I was trying to understand how he had come to his death, and when, and where, she took umbrage at my curiosity, or manner, or something. She and her friend jumped into a hansom cab, which dashed off at the rate of about 20 miles, leaving Rudd and I on the curbstone, staring after it like moonstruck gabbies. End of chapter 31. Recording by Zaanta. Chapter 32 of the Joss, a Reversion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zaanta. The Joss, a Reversion by Richard Marsh. Chapter 32. The little discussion between the several parties. That night we held a consultation, we four. It was getting dead low tide with us. If we didn't light upon those treasures of a temple, we should have to find a ship instead, and that before long, if we had to go aboard of her as cabin boys. It seemed to me that something might be got out of Mr. Paine, in the way of information. Things pointed that way. The more I thought, the more they seemed to point. I told the others. We decided to wait upon him in a body, and man the pumps for all we were worth. If he proved dry, if nothing could be got out of him, then we should have to admit that the tide was low, and that we were stranded. But we had hopes. The morning after we were in Mitre Court, where his rooms were betimes. The idea was that he shouldn't escape us, that we should see him as soon as he was visible, and so play the part of the early bird that catches the worm. But when we found that the door into the street was open, I, knowing the lay of the land, without any parley, led the way upstairs. And it was well for him we did, for we came upon as lively a little scene as ever we'd encountered. There was a larger company assembled than we had expected. Quite what was happening we couldn't at once make out. The first thing I saw was a girl tied down upon a table, and, of all the people in the world, that cursing gentleman leaning over her with a knife in his hand. Having torn her clothes open at the throat, he looked as if he was going to write his name on her nice white skin with the point of his blade. He got no farther than the start. I introduced myself, and landed him one. He didn't seem to know whether he was glad or sorry to meet me. I loosed the girl. When I looked round I saw the room was in a mess, and on the floor, trussed like a fowl, was Mr. Paine. But what made me almost jump out of skin for joy was the sight of our dear friend Luke tied up beside him. I released that excellent first officer. Then things were said. When he understood that we were spoiling to cut him into little pieces, and that it seemed likely that he had fallen from the frying pan into the fire, he explained. What we wanted to know was the present address at which Mr. Batters could be found. It seemed, according to him, that he was aching to know it too. Bless my beautiful eyes! He spat upon the floor. Do you think, if I knew where the heart he was, that I'd be here? He used me shameful, he did that. It seems incredible that he should have used you badly, Mr. Luke. It does, after all I'd done for him. But he did. After we... He coughed. I finished his sentence. Had taken such a ceremonious leave of us all on board the Flying Scud. Yes, go on. We got picked up by a liner as was making Suez. As you anticipated you would be. I see. You're a far-sighted person, Mr. Luke. They landed us at Suez. We stopped there 2 or 3 days getting packing cases to pack the treasures of the temple in. They must have been rather conspicuous objects to carry about with you anyhow. Go on. Then hang me if one evening I didn't wake up and find that I'd been senseless for close on 2 days. The devil had hocused me. Hocused you? Impossible. He had. Then he'd slipped away, him and his blessed daughter, while I was more dead than alive, leaving me with as good as nothing in my pockets. What I had to go through no one knows. If I ever do set eyes on him again, I'll... The peroration was a study of adjectives. Then it appears that you are just as eager to have another interview with Mr. Benjamin Batters as we are. I am sorry your venture was not attended with better fortune. It deserved success. Pray, what were you to have had out of it? I was to have had half the blooming lot. And the girl... And the girl? Indeed. And the girl? Mr. Luke, I should dearly like... Mr. Paine interposed. Excuse me, Captain Lander, but if it is of Mr. Benjamin Batters you are speaking, if it is to him so many mysterious references have been made as the great Joss, then I may state that, to the best of my knowledge and belief, that gentleman is dead. Dead? To the best of your knowledge and belief? What do you mean? As I stared at him, a remark was made by the young lady who so narrowly escaped being made the subject of an experiment in carving. Although evidently very far from being as much herself as she might have been, she had pulled herself together a little, and was holding both hands up to her throat. You're forgetting that Polly's lying perhaps worse than dead in Camford Street. Mr. Paine gave a jump. I had forgotten it, upon my honour. What's that? I asked. Miss Blyth, to whom Miss Purvis refers as Polly, is the niece of the Mr. Batters of whom we have been speaking. She's his heiress, in fact. His heiress? Yes, his sole residuary legatee. Among other things, he left her a house in Camford Street, number 84, on somewhat mysterious conditions. For instance, she was to allow no man to enter it. No man? No,
Only she and one feminine friend were ever to be allowed to put their feet inside the door."
"Oh?" I began to smell a rat. Mr. Paine waved his hand towards the young lady the cursing gentleman had been about to practise on.
"This is Miss Purvis, the feminine friend whom Miss Blyth chose to be her sole companion." Other conditions were attached to the bequest equally mysterious. Indeed, it would really seem as if there was something in that house in Camford Street the existence of which the late Mr. Batters was particularly anxious should be concealed from the world. Miss Blyth only entered on the occupation of her property yesterday. Yet Miss Purvis came at an early hour this morning to tell me that something extraordinary had happened in the middle of the night. Something, she doesn't quite know what, but fancies it was some wild animal, made a savage attack upon Miss Blyth without the slightest provocation. And when Miss Purvis recovered from the shock which the occurrence gave her, she found that she herself had been thrown into the street. "Mr. Paine." I laid my hand upon the lawyer's shoulder. "Do you know what's inside that house?" "I haven't the faintest notion. How should I have?"
"It's the late Mr. Batters."
"The late Mr. Batters?"
"The thing the existence of which Mr. Batters was most anxious to keep concealed was Mr. Batters himself, for reasons. So he's put about a cock and bull story making out he's dead, and then hidden himself in this house of which you're talking."
"Captain Lander."
"Mind, it's only my guess, as yet, but I don't think you'll find that I'm sailing very wide of the wind. The more I turn things over, after listening to what you've said, the more likely it seems to me that the great Joss, whom we've all been on tiptoe to get a peep at, has hidden himself in that house which he pretends to have left to his niece, and is waiting there for us to find him. And I'm off to do it."
"Someone's had the start of you."
The interruption came from Rudd. The absence of the cursing gentleman and his two friends explained his meaning. "They've gone hot foot after him," I cried.
"What's good enough for them is good enough for me."
We journeyed in 3 cabs. Speed was a consideration, so we chartered hansoms. I went in front with Luke. He didn't seem over and above anxious for my society, but I didn't feel as if I could be comfortable without him. So we went together. Though I am bound to admit that I'm inclined to think that I enjoyed that ride more than he did. Rudd, Holly, and his chum came next. Mr. Paine and the young lady last. I liked his manner towards that young lady. In a lawyer whom one naturally looks upon as the most hard-hearted of human creatures, it was beautiful. He could not have treated her more tenderly if she had been a queen. And, though she was still in a very sad condition, I have a sort of idea that, when they were once inside that cab, speed with them wasn't much of a consideration. And though those hansoms did rattle us along in style, we found that someone had got to that house in Camford Street in front of us. End of chapter 32. Recording by Zaanta. Chapter 33 of the Joss, a Reversion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zaanta. The Joss, a Reversion, by Richard Marsh. Chapter 33. In the Presence. The cursing gentleman and his two friends were awaiting us upon the pavement. I said a word of a kind to the long 'un. "Look here, my bald-headed friend, I don't quite know who you are or what you want, but I've seen enough of your little ways to know they're funny. So if you take my advice you'll make yourself scarce before there's trouble." He held out his hands, looking, on the dirty pavement of that shabby street, like a fish out of water.
The great Joss, the great Joss, he is in there. Give him back to us, then we go."
I reflected. After all, there was some reason in the creature. He was almost as much interested in Mr. Batters as I was. Considering how Mr. Batters had treated me, I didn't see why he shouldn't learn what an object of interest he really was. It might occasion him agreeable surprise. The fellow was in such dead earnest. It beat me how he and his friends had got where they were. Reminding me of the flocks of migratory birds which one meets far out at sea. Goodness only knows by what instinct they pursue the objects of their search. I turned to Mr. Paine. This gentleman was high priest, or something of the kind, in the temple in which Mr. Batters was number one god. Number one god? That's about the size of it. He was a god when I first made his acquaintance. This gentleman's own particular. Since he and his friends have come a good many thousand miles to get another peep at him, I don't think there'll be much harm in letting him have one, if it's to be got. So far as I'm concerned, Right Reverend Sir, you can stop and see the fun." Mr. Paine stared. He didn't understand. The look with which he regarded the foreign gentleman wasn't friendly. The experience he had had of his peculiar methods was a trifle recent. Perhaps it rankled. I turned my attention to the house, in front of which the lot of us were standing, cabs and all. The question is, since no one seems inclined to open the door, how are we going to get in to enable us to pay our little morning call? Rudd practically suggested one way by hurling himself against the door as if he had been a battering ram. He might as well have tried his luck against a stone wall. As much impression would have been made. When I ran my stick over it, it sounded to me like a sheet of metal. Luke proffered his opinion. "You'll want a long chisel for this job, or a pair. Nothing else'll do it. That door's been put there to keep people out, not to let 'em in. It'll be like breaking into a strong room." Luke proved right. All our efforts were unavailing. That door had been built to keep folks out.
"If this is going to be a case for chisels," said Rudd, "we'd better start on it at once, before those police come interfering."
We were already centres of attraction to a rapidly increasing crowd. Our goings-on provided entertainment of a kind they didn't care to miss. Long before we had put that job through, the police did come. What is more, we were glad to see them. Rudd fetched a pair of crowbars from an ironmonger's shop close by. With his assistance, and acting under his instructions, we started to shift that door. We never got beyond the starting. We might as well have tried to shift the monument. He rigged up contrivances, tried dodges. There was the door just as tight as ever. And just as we were thinking of breaking the heads of some of the members of that interested crowd, up the police did come. Mr. Paine explained to them what we were after. Then he and the young lady and Rudd went off with one of them to the station, while another stayed behind. In course of time they returned, together with an inspector, 3 more policemen, and 2 specimens of the British working man, who were wheeling something on a barrow. The interest of the crowd increased. The new arrivals were received with cheers. Those workmen, in conjunction with Isaac Rudd, fitted up a machine upon the pavement. It was some kind of a drill, I believe. Presently not one but half a dozen holes had been cut right through that door. Into these were inserted crowbars of a different construction to those we had been using. We all lent a hand. And the door was open. The crowd pressed forward.
"Keep back!"
cried the inspector. And the police kept them back. The inspector entered, with the young lady, Mr. Paine, Rudd, and I. The rest were kept out, including the cursing gentleman and his 2 friends, which seemed hard on them after all they must have gone through. But it was little that they lost. At the beginning, anyhow. For as soon as we set foot inside the passage, we found that there was another door defying us. It seemed to lead into a room upon our left. Rudd called one of the workmen in to consult with him. They sounded the door. They sounded the wall. And concluded that the shortest way into the room was through the wall. So soon the house was being knocked to pieces before our eyes. There was sheet iron on the other side of that wall, but they were through it in what seemed no time. And there was a great hole, large enough to admit of the passage of a man. And on the other side of this hole stood Susie. She stared at us, and we stared at her, neither understanding who the other was. But when I did understand, I felt as if my legs were giving way. And something inside me set up a clamour which was deafening. And when she saw it was me, she called out, "Max!" She was through that wall like a flash of lightning. I had her in my arms almost before I knew it. "Susie," I said, "my sweet." I could tell by the way of her that she knew more about wives than she did when I saw her last, and that she had grown reconciled to the idea of being one. And perhaps a bit more than reconciled. The fates be thanked. Miss Blyth was in the room with her, alive and sound, and, indeed, unhurt. They had been frightened out of their wits when they heard us, and at the noise we made, thinking they were going to be murdered at the least. "Where's your father?" I asked.
"When he brought her in," she answered,
meaning Miss Blyth.
"he went out, shutting the door behind him, taking the key. He left us prisoners. We've been prisoners ever since. We've heard and seen nothing of him. Where he is I don't know. Unless he's above."
He was above, in a room at the top of the house, with another door to it, so that we had to get through the wall again. He had had a sort of throne rigged up, intending maybe to have an imitation of the one which he had occupied when I had first come upon him in the temple. If that was so, the imitation was a precious poor one. But he was on it, dead, and cold. He had been gone some hours. Whether he had committed suicide, or whether the end had come to him in the ordinary course of nature, there was nothing to show. A colony of snakes was in the room, those favourites of his. One shared the throne with the great Joss. It was on the seat in front of him, where his legs ought to have been. My idea was that the thing had killed him, but it seemed that that was not the case. The creatures were declared not to be venomous, and there was no mark of a snake bite about him anyhow. While we stood looking at the throne and what was on it, there was a movement behind. The cursing gentleman and his two friends came in. At sight of the great Joss they threw themselves on their faces and bit the floor. I never saw men so scared, or so surprised. I had a sort of notion that they had supposed him to be immortal, and that he couldn't die. When the body came to be examined, and it was discovered what a torso it really was, and to what prolonged and hideous tortures the man must have been subjected, one began to understand that they might have had reasons of their own for thinking so. It might very well have been incomprehensible to them why, if he could die, he had not died. At the foot of the throne was the little doll-like thing which I had seen perched on the head of the £50,000 monstrosity. He had called it the God of Fortune, saying that where it was he was not far away. The case seemed to present an illustration of the truth of his words. The doll was broken to atoms. The great Joss and the God of Fortune seemed to have come to an end together. End of chapter 33. Recording by Zaanta.
Chapter 34 of The Joss, a Reversion. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. The Joss, a Reversion by Richard Marsh. Chapter 34. Author's Postscript. How matters stand today. I should have preferred that the close of Captain Max Lander's statement should have been the conclusion of this strange history. But for the satisfaction of any reader who may desire to know what became of A, B, C, or D, these following lines are added. What have been described by Captain Lander as the treasures of the temple were found in the house in Camford Street, so far as could be ascertained, intact. The question of ownership involved a nice legal problem. The native attendants of the temple vanished almost as soon as they appeared. No one knew where they went to. Nothing has been seen or heard of them since. It seemed, therefore, that they put forward no claims. There remained the girl, Susan, presumably the dead man's daughter, though there was no legal proof of the fact. Mary Blyth, who had claims under her uncle's will, Captain Lander, who held the document entitling him to half a share, and the owners and crew of the Flying Scud. All these had claims which required consideration. In the end, by great good fortune, an amicable settlement was arrived at which gave satisfaction to all parties concerned. As might have been expected, the value set on the property by Mr. Batters proved to be an exaggeration. It was worth nothing like £1 million. Still, it fetched a considerable amount when realised, and after the owners and crew of the Flying Scud had been appeased, excepting Mr. Luke, who was markedly dissatisfied because he only received an ordinary seaman's share, an appreciable sum remained as surplus. To this was added the cash which had been bequeathed to Miss Blyth by the will, whose validity was at best extremely doubtful, the whole being divided in equal portions between the niece and the daughter. As Miss Batters immediately afterwards became Mrs. Max Lander, the commander of the Flying Scud had no cause to be discontented with this arrangement. Number 84 Camford Street is still without an owner. It appears, from the story told by the girl Susan, that on reaching England, her father hurried her from place to place, seldom stopping for more than 2 or 3 days under one roof. They seem to have made their most lengthy stay in a barge in one of the lower reaches of the river. No doubt the notion of concealment was present to his mind from the first, though how he lighted on the house in Camford Street is still a mystery, nor has anything transpired to show by whose orders it was fortified in such ingenious and elaborate fashion, nor by whom the work was executed. Nothing has been found which goes to show that he had any right to call the house his property. Its actual ownership still goes begging. The document purporting to be a will was possibly drawn up by his own hand. The letter signed Arthur Leonard Missionary, pretending to announce his death on that far-off Australian island, was probably concocted at his instigation by one of the miscellaneous acquaintances whom he picked up during his wanderings among the riverside vagabonds. From such a one he might have acquired Mr. Payne's name, together with some sidelights on that gentleman's character. Miss Batters made it abundantly clear that her father was the freak to whom Mr. Payne was of service by rescuing him from the too curious crowd in the Commercial Road. His exact object in making his will has never been shown. No doubt the man's brain was in disorder. He was actuated, perhaps, by 3 considerations: the desire for concealment, the consciousness that he and his daughter would fare very badly if shut up in a house alone together, the wish to avail himself of his niece's services. To have gone to her with a straightforward tale would have been in accord neither with his character or policy. He had lived too long in what, for civility's sake, may be called a diplomatic atmosphere, to be able to breathe in any other. Also, he knew nothing of his niece, suspected that she knew nothing good of him, was moved possibly by a very natural unwillingness to make himself or his story known to her until he had learned what kind of person she was. So he invented his own death, making her his heiress for the sole purpose of getting her inside the house. It is impossible to say what might have happened had she proved amenable to his wishes, and events moved along the road which he had laid down for them. The presumption is that sooner or later, probably sooner, he would have made himself known to her, and endeavoured to purchase her fidelity and services on terms of his own. As it is, the uncle is the constant theme of the niece's conversation. Miss Blyth is now Mrs. Cooper. The Coopers are residents of one of the smaller south coast watering places, where they are regarded as leading lights among local social circles. Mr. Cooper is a vice-president of the boat club, yacht club, swimming club, cricket club, football club, and so on. His wife is the mother of an increasing family and a lady with a tail. Its subject is Uncle Benjamin. That gentleman lived a life of strange and varied adventure. His history loses none of its marvels at his niece's lips, either because they are a trifle tired of the theme, or are merely jealous. Some of the more frequent hearers have been heard to doubt if there ever was an Uncle Benjamin. If these doubts are serious, they do the lady less than justice. Mr. and Mrs. Lander are also happy. One would be reluctant to doubt it. Yet, at the same time, one cannot refuse to admit that there are occasions when the outward and visible signs of their happiness take a somewhat boisterous shape. He has a temper. She has a temper. There are moments when it would appear as if there was hardly room for the 2 tempers in a single house. Since they seldom remain in one place for more than 3 months, they can scarcely be said to live anywhere. In selecting their next abiding place, they seem to act on the principle of letting it be as far from the present as possible. Mr. Lander has not pursued his profession since the last eventful voyage which he has herein set forth. Possibly by way of killing time, he is apt to be a trifle too convivial. Nothing makes Mrs. Lander more indignant than an even hinted doubt of her positive assertion, made in and out of season, that every drop of blood in her veins is English. As her complexion is a little dusky, her aggressive attitude upon this point makes her rather a difficult person to get on with. Mr. Frank Payne, oddly enough, has married Miss Purvis, and, what is perhaps still more odd, theirs is the happiest match of the three. About their complete and absolute content with their condition there can be no possible doubt whatever. He worships her, she worships him. If there is any finer recipe for matrimonial happiness than that, it has not come in the present writer's way. His practice as a solicitor has grown large. Mrs. Payne is of opinion that he is rightly regarded with even fulsome reverence by the entire bench and bar. Since he would not dream of contesting any opinion which happened to be his wife's, the position of affairs could not possibly be improved. Mr. Benjamin Batters lies in Kensal Green Cemetery, in a deep grave and in a full-sized coffin, surrounded by dignitaries and respectabilities. In his coffin were placed the broken pieces of the curiosity which he called the God of Fortune. So they are still together. A handsome monument has been raised above him. There is no hint in the inscription that below are but the mangled fragments of what was once a human body, or any reference to the fact that he ever posed as a Joss, or a god, or was ever believed, even by savages, to have put on immortality before his time. It simply says, "Beneath this stone reposes Benjamin Batters, who, after a life of varied adventure in different parts of the world, sleeps well." We will hope that it is so. The end. End of chapter 34. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. End of the Joss, a Reversion, by Richard Marsh.